The abandoned German half-track sat twisted against the frozen roadside like a metal gravestone, its tracks blown off and scattered across the icy asphalt. Second Lieutenant Audie Murphy crouched behind its armored hull, studying the terrain ahead through field glasses that kept fogging in the bitter January cold. The Vosges Mountains stretched endlessly around them, snow-laden pines creating perfect concealment for enemy positions that could be anywhere or nowhere. His platoon had been moving through these frozen forests for 3 days, following reports of German withdrawal that seemed less reliable with each mile they covered. The 3rd Infantry Division's advance had slowed to a crawl, as winter weather and stubborn resistance turned what should have been a pursuit into a careful probe through hostile territory where every bend in the road could hide an ambush. Murphy lowered the binoculars and glanced back at his men, spread out along the ditch behind him. Private Henderson was shivering despite his heavy overcoat, his rifle held with hands so cold the metal probably burned his skin even through wool gloves. Sergeant Torres kept checking his watch, knowing they were already an hour behind their scheduled link-up with Baker Company at the road junction ahead. The radio operator, Corporal Jameson, was hunched over his equipment, trying to raise headquarters through the static that seemed to plague all communications in these mountains. Every few minutes he'd shake his head and adjust the antenna, muttering curses that fogged the air around his mouth. The silence from command meant they were operating on yesterday's intelligence, which, in the Vosges Mountains of eastern France, could be worse than no intelligence at all. Murphy studied the road ahead, noting how it curved around a small hill before disappearing into another stand of pine trees. Perfect terrain for a roadblock, he thought, remembering the lessons about German defensive tactics that seemed more relevant with each passing day. The enemy had been falling back, but falling back toward prepared positions where they could make every American advance cost blood. A metallic clank echoed from somewhere ahead, the sound carrying clearly in the cold air. Murphy held up his fist, and the platoon froze instantly. For 30 seconds nobody moved. Then came the unmistakable rumble of diesel engines, growing louder as they approached the curve in the road. "Contact front," Murphy whispered, his voice barely audible even to Torres, who was crouched just 5 feet away. The first German vehicle appeared around the bend, not retreating, but advancing. A half-dozen Wehrmacht soldiers moved alongside an armored car, their winter camouflage making them nearly invisible against the snow-covered landscape. Behind them, Murphy could see the angular silhouette of what looked like a tank destroyer, its long gun traversing slowly as it searched for targets. Henderson started to raise his rifle, but Murphy caught his arm and shook his head. 23 Americans against what appeared to be a full German patrol, possibly with armor support, in terrain that favored the defense. The tactical manual would call for immediate withdrawal to a better position, but Murphy found himself studying the abandoned half-track they were using for cover, noting its thick armor plating and the way its position commanded the road junction. The German patrol was moving with the confidence of troops who believed they owned this stretch of road. Their point man wasn't even bothering to check the ditches properly, focused instead on the path ahead. Murphy realized they probably had no idea an American patrol was anywhere in the area, which meant the element of surprise belonged to his platoon. For maybe the next 30 seconds. Torres crawled up beside him, close enough that Murphy could smell the coffee on his breath from their brief halt an hour earlier. "What's the call, Lieutenant?" The sergeant's voice carried years of combat experience, and Murphy could hear the unspoken question, "Do we run, or do we fight from a position that might get us all killed?" Murphy looked back at his men, then forward at the approaching Germans, then at the twisted metal of the half-track that had become their accidental fortress. In that moment, he understood that some decisions couldn't be made from a manual or a briefing room. Sometimes you had to trust what you could see with your own eyes and hope that courage would be enough to bridge the gap between what you were supposed to do and what the situation actually demanded. The diesel rumble was getting louder, And Murphy could hear German voices now, casual conversation between soldiers who thought they were safe in their own territory. In less than a minute, they'd be close enough to spot the American positions, and then the choice would be made for him. If stories like this make you imagine what you'd do under fire, tell us in the comments how you think you'd react in this situation, and stay with us for the next chapters. The German armored car rolled past their position, its commander standing in the open hatch, scanning the forest on both sides of the road. Murphy pressed himself deeper into the frozen ditch, feeling the cold seep through his field jacket as he counted enemy soldiers. 8, maybe 9 Wehrmacht troops in winter gear, moving with the steady rhythm of veterans who'd been fighting in these mountains for months. Behind the armored car came the tank destroyer, its massive gun now clearly visible as it ground forward on steel tracks that threw up chunks of ice and gravel. The vehicle's flanks were scarred with impact marks from previous encounters, and Murphy could see spare track links welded to its armor, the kind of field modifications that spoke of hard fighting and crews who expected to need them again. Corporal Jameson had given up on the radio, the static-filled frequencies offering nothing but broken transmissions that could have been from any unit in the 3rd Infantry Division sector. They were operating alone, with outdated intelligence, and no clear picture of what lay beyond the next hill. The kind of tactical void that could swallow a platoon without anyone knowing where they'd gone. Murphy watched the German point man approach the curve where their own advance had stalled. In another few seconds, the enemy would have line of sight to the road junction that Baker Company was supposed to reach by 1400 hours. If the Germans held that position, they could interdict American movement along the entire supply route that ran through this section of the Vosges Mountains, turning a minor patrol action into a significant tactical problem. The lieutenant found himself studying the abandoned half-track again, noting how its thick armor had absorbed whatever blast had disabled it. The vehicle's rear deck was scattered with equipment that looked American, probably from a previous engagement where some other unit had tried to cross this same ground. The sight of familiar gear made his chest tighten as he imagined the firefight that had left this metal hulk as a monument to someone else's bad day. Henderson was breathing hard beside him, vapor rising from his mouth despite his efforts to stay quiet. The private was 19 years old, same as Murphy, but he still had the wide-eyed look of someone who hadn't quite accepted that people were actively trying to kill him. Murphy remembered having that same expression during his first weeks in combat, before experience taught him that survival required a different kind of attention to detail. Torres had crawled back along the ditch to check on the rest of the platoon, and Murphy could see him making hand signals to position the squad automatic rifles where they could cover the road if shooting started. The sergeant moved with the economy of motion that came from too many firefights in too many places, his face showing the kind of fatigue that went deeper than just missing sleep. The German tank destroyer's engine note changed as it downshifted for the curve, and Murphy realized the crew was being careful about their approach to the road junction. They might not know about the American patrol, but they were taking the kind of precautions that suggested this wasn't their first time operating in contested territory. Professional soldiers doing a professional job, which would make them harder to surprise and more dangerous once they understood what they were facing. Murphy checked his carbine, ensuring the safety was off and the 30-round magazine was properly seated. Around him, he could hear the subtle sounds of his men preparing for contact. Safeties clicking, equipment being adjusted, the soft scrape of rifles being positioned for quick use. 23 soldiers getting ready to fight from a position they'd stumbled into by accident. The German voices were getting clearer now, and Murphy realized one of them was giving directions to the tank destroyer crew. He couldn't understand the words, but the tone suggested someone who knew this terrain well, possibly a local guide or an officer who'd been operating in the area for weeks. The kind of tactical knowledge that could turn a simple patrol into a carefully planned operation with objectives Murphy couldn't even guess at. The armored car's commander was still standing in his hatch, binoculars raised as he studied the road junction ahead. In a few more seconds, he'd be close enough to spot any sign of American presence: tracks in the snow, disturbed vegetation, or the subtle wrongness that experienced soldiers learned to recognize when an area had been recently occupied. Murphy found himself calculating distances and angles, noting how the abandoned half-track's position offered both cover and concealment while commanding the approaches to the road junction. It wasn't the kind of position anyone would choose from a map, but sometimes the terrain offered opportunities that existed only in the moment, requiring decisions that couldn't wait for higher approval or detailed planning. The diesel rumble filled the air now, mixing with the sound of boots crunching through frozen snow and the metallic clink of equipment carried by soldiers who'd been marching for hours. Murphy realized this wasn't just a patrol. It was a unit, moving with purpose toward an objective that probably involved denying this road junction to American forces for the foreseeable future. The German tank destroyer ground to a halt at the road junction, its long gun swiveling to cover the approaches while the commander's voice carried clearly in the cold air. Murphy didn't need to understand German to recognize the tone of someone setting up a defensive position with the intention of staying a while. The Wehrmacht soldiers spread out along the roadside, their movements efficient and professional as they began preparing fighting positions in the frozen ground. From his concealment behind the wrecked half-track, Murphy counted at least 12 enemy soldiers now, with the possibility of more still hidden inside the armored vehicles. The German commander had positioned his tank destroyer where its main gun could interdict traffic from 3 directions, while the armored car provided close-in protection against infantry assault. It was textbook defensive deployment, executed by troops who clearly understood the tactical value of this particular piece of ground. Sergeant Torres crawled back to Murphy's position, his face grim as he reported what he'd observed from his vantage point further down the ditch. "They're digging in, Lieutenant, setting up like they plan to stay for a while. And there's more movement in the tree line about 200 yards back. Looks like they've got support coming up." Murphy nodded, processing this information against what he knew about their own situation. Baker Company was supposed to reach this road junction in less than an hour, expecting to find it clear of enemy forces. Instead, they'd be walking into a prepared ambush unless someone could either eliminate the German position or get word back to warn them off. The radio remained stubbornly silent, despite Jameson's continued efforts to raise headquarters. The mountains seemed to swallow radio signals, leaving American units operating in isolation while German forces moved through terrain they'd had months to prepare. Murphy realized that his platoon might be the only friendly force in position to observe or influence what happened at this road junction in the next critical hour. Henderson was shivering more violently now, his face pale with cold, and the growing realization that their patrol had stumbled into something significantly larger than anyone had anticipated. The private kept glancing at Murphy, looking for some sign of what they were supposed to do in a situation that hadn't been covered in any briefing or tactical exercise. Murphy found himself studying the abandoned half-track again, noting details he'd missed in his initial assessment. The vehicle's deck guns were still in place, their ammunition boxes scattered but apparently intact. Someone had tried to disable the weapons, but the job looked hurried, the kind of quick sabotage that might not have been completely successful. If the guns could be made functional. The German tank destroyer's engine shut down, and suddenly the forest seemed almost quiet, except for the sound of soldiers working to improve their positions. Murphy could hear entrenching tools biting into frozen earth, the scrape of equipment being positioned, and occasional conversation between troops who felt secure enough to speak in normal voices. They were settling in for an extended stay. Torres followed Murphy's gaze to the half-track's weapon systems. "You thinking what I think you're thinking, Lieutenant? Because that would be about the craziest thing I've seen since Sicily." Murphy didn't answer immediately. still calculating angles and distances, while part of his mind wondered what the after-action report would say about whatever decision he made in the next few minutes. The manual said to withdraw in the face of superior forces, establish observation at a safe distance, and report contact to higher headquarters. But the manual had been written by people who'd never crouched in a frozen ditch watching professional enemy soldiers prepare to slaughter an unsuspecting American company. The sound of diesel engines echoed from somewhere beyond the tree line, confirming Torres' observation about German reinforcements. Whatever unit was setting up at the road junction, they had support coming, possibly enough to turn this stretch of road into a killing field that could disrupt American operations throughout this sector of the Vosges Mountains. Murphy thought about the men in Baker Company, soldiers like Henderson who trusted that someone would warn them if they were walking into an ambush. He thought about the tactical situation developing around a road junction that had seemed unimportant yesterday, but was clearly critical to German defensive plans. And he thought about the abandoned half-track that chance had positioned exactly where it might make a difference if someone was willing to take the kind of risk that would either save lives or end them. Jameson looked up from his radio, shaking his head to indicate the communications blackout was still in effect. No word to higher headquarters, no coordination with adjacent units, no artillery support or airstrikes that might level the playing field. Just 23 American soldiers with small arms, facing a growing German force that was digging in to control terrain they'd need for their own operations. Murphy realized that some decisions couldn't wait for perfect information or higher approval. Sometimes you had to trust your own assessment of what was necessary, even when what was necessary looked impossible from any reasonable perspective. Would you follow the orders exactly, or trust what your own eyes and instincts tell you in a moment like this? Comment which path you take, and share this episode with someone who loves real human stories from history. Murphy made his decision with the sudden clarity that sometimes comes when all other options disappear. He turned to Torres, his voice barely a whisper against the sounds of German soldiers fortifying their position. I'm going to get to those deck guns on the half-track. When I open fire, you take the squad and hit their left flank. Don't try to overrun them, just keep them busy long enough for me to knock out that tank destroyer. Torres stared at him for a long moment, and Murphy could see the sergeant calculating the odds of survival for a plan that involved one man crossing open ground to reach weapons that might not even function, then engaging a superior force from a fixed position with no escape route. Lieutenant, that's suicide. You'll be completely exposed on that vehicle, and they'll concentrate every weapon they have on your position. Murphy was already checking his equipment, ensuring his ammunition pouches were secure and his carbine sling wouldn't tangle if he had to move fast. The abandoned half-track sat about 40 yards away across ground that offered minimal concealment. A sprint that would take perhaps 8 seconds if he was fast and lucky, an eternity if the Germans spotted him before he reached cover. Baker Company is counting on this road being clear. If we let those Germans set up their ambush, we'll lose a lot more than one platoon. The logic was unassailable, but Torres knew better than Murphy what it would feel like to watch his lieutenant charge across open ground toward almost certain death. The sergeant had seen too many acts of desperate courage that ended with good men dead, and the tactical situation unchanged except for the addition of more grief to carry. Henderson overheard enough of the conversation to understand what Murphy was planning, and his face went pale with something beyond cold. The private had been in combat long enough to recognize the difference between reasonable risk and the kind of action that got written up in citations because there weren't enough survivors to explain what had really happened. Murphy studied the route to the half-track one more time, noting a shallow depression that might provide concealment for the first 20 yards. After that, he'd be completely exposed until he reached the vehicle's armor protection. The German tank destroyer crew would have a clear shot, and their main gun could probably penetrate the half-track's armor at this range if they had time to traverse and fire. The sound of approaching vehicles grew louder, and Murphy realized their window for action was closing rapidly. Once the German reinforcements arrived, any assault would be hopeless, regardless of how well coordinated or how desperate. It was now or never, with the fate of Baker Company hanging on whether one man could reach a disabled vehicle and make its weapons functional under direct fire. Murphy handed his carbine to Henderson, keeping only his pistol and the grenades from his belt. The deck guns would be his primary weapons if he reached them, assuming they could be brought into action quickly enough to matter. Everything depended on speed and the element of surprise lasting long enough for him to engage targets before the Germans could concentrate their fire on his position. Torres was positioning the squad for their diversionary attack, his movements efficient despite the impossibility of what they were attempting. The sergeant understood that Murphy's survival depended on drawing German attention away from the half-track, which meant exposing his own men to concentrated fire from prepared positions. It was the kind of tactical equation that made sense on paper, but felt like murder when you were giving the orders. Murphy took a deep breath of the freezing air, tasting cordite and diesel fumes mixed with the clean scent of snow-covered pine trees. In a few seconds, he would leave the relative safety of the ditch and commit himself to a course of action that would either destroy the German position or end with his body sprawled across the half-track's deck. There was no middle ground, no opportunity to reassess once he started moving. The German voices continued their casual conversation, soldiers unaware that their tactical situation was about to change dramatically. Murphy could hear someone laughing at a joke he couldn't understand, the sound carrying clearly in air so cold it made every noise seem sharper and more immediate. Professional troops enjoying a brief moment of normalcy before the shooting started. Murphy caught Torres's eye and nodded once. The sergeant's expression said everything that couldn't be spoken aloud: respect for what Murphy was attempting, grief for what would probably happen, and the grim determination to make the lieutenant's sacrifice count for something if it came to that. The dashboard clock on the disabled half-track showed 1,347 hours. In 13 minutes, Baker Company would reach this road junction expecting to find it secure. Murphy realized that history would pivot on the next few seconds, on whether one man could cover 40 yards of open ground and bring disabled weapons back into action before superior forces could respond. He rose from the ditch and began to run. Murphy's boots hit the frozen ground in a rhythm that seemed impossibly loud as he sprinted across the open space toward the half-track. Behind him, Torres opened fire with the squad automatic rifle, the sharp crack of American weapons suddenly filling the forest as his diversionary attack began. German voices shifted instantly from casual conversation to shouted commands, but Murphy forced himself not to look back, focusing entirely on the metal sanctuary that seemed both impossibly far away and rushing toward him with each stride. A German machine gun opened up from the road junction, its measured burst cutting through the air where Murphy had been a second earlier. He dove the last few yards, rolling behind the half-track's armor as bullets sparked off the metal around him. His hands were shaking as he scrambled up onto the vehicle's deck, but not from fear, from the crystalline focus that came when everything else fell away except the immediate task of staying alive. The half-track's deck guns were exactly what he'd hoped for: twin 50-caliber machine guns with ammunition boxes that appeared intact despite the hasty sabotage attempt. Someone had tried to disable the weapons by damaging the charging handles, but it was the kind of quick field work that could be reversed if you knew what you were doing and had enough time before the enemy adjusted their fire to your position. Murphy worked frantically to clear the jammed mechanisms, his fingers made clumsy by cold and the adrenaline flooding his system. Around him, the sound of gunfire was intensifying as Torres's squad engaged the German positions, drawing return fire that was steadily increasing in volume and accuracy. The diversion was working, but it couldn't last long against superior numbers in prepared positions. The German tank destroyer's main gun boomed, and Murphy felt the half-track shudder as the high-explosive round detonated somewhere behind his position. The crew was trying to eliminate his squad's firing positions, methodically working over the tree line where Torres had positioned his men. In a few minutes, they'd turn their attention to the half-track itself, and no amount of armor would protect against a direct hit from that massive gun. Murphy got the first machine gun operational just as a group of German infantry began moving to flank his position. His opening burst caught them in the open, the heavy slugs cutting through winter camouflage and sending the survivors diving for whatever cover they could find. The satisfying thump of the weapon firing was accompanied by the bitter smell of cordite and the sharp clang of ejected brass bouncing off the half-track's deck. But even as he engaged the infantry, Murphy could see the tactical situation developing around him. More German soldiers were moving up from the tree line, and the tank destroyer was beginning to traverse its gun toward his position. He had perhaps 30 seconds before that massive cannon would fire directly at the half-track, ending both his attack and any chance of warning Baker Company about the ambush waiting at the road junction. The second machine gun came online with a mechanical click that sounded beautiful in Murphy's ears. Now he had overlapping fields of fire that could cover both approaches to his position, but the ammunition wouldn't last forever, and he was completely cut off from any possibility of withdrawal. This was a one-way mission that would end either with the German position destroyed or with his own death on this metal deck. Murphy traversed both guns toward the tank destroyer, knowing he had one chance to disable the vehicle before its main armament could engage him directly. The armor on the German vehicle's flanks was thicker than what his machine guns could penetrate, but there were vision ports, track assemblies, and external equipment that might be vulnerable to concentrated fire from heavy weapons at close range. His sustained burst walked across the tank destroyer's hull, sparks flying as armor-piercing rounds searched for weak spots in the vehicle's protection. One of the external fuel tanks erupted in orange flame, and Murphy could see German crew members bailing out of the vehicle as fire spread across its engine compartment. The main gun was still operational, but without a crew to serve it, the massive weapon was just an expensive sculpture. The German infantry was regrouping for another assault on his position, and Murphy could see Torres's squad falling back under pressure from superior numbers. His diversionary attack had accomplished its mission, but now the full weight of enemy fire was concentrating on the half-track. Bullets sparked off armor around him, and Murphy realized he was completely alone on a burning vehicle with limited ammunition and no way to retreat. But Baker Company's radios were probably starting to crackle with warnings now, as the sound of heavy fighting echoed through the mountains. The ambush was blown, the road junction was contested, and American forces would know to approach this area with the caution that might save dozens of lives. Whatever happened to Murphy in the next few minutes, his mission was accomplished. He continued firing until the ammunition was exhausted, then used his grenades against the German infantry, still trying to reach his position. When the explosions stopped echoing through the forest, and strange quiet settled over the battlefield, broken only by the crackling of flames from the burning tank destroyer and the distant sound of American voices as Baker Company's scouts reached the edge of the engagement area. Murphy slumped against the half-track's armor, his ears ringing from the gunfire and his hands cramped around weapon grips he couldn't seem to release. He was still alive somehow, on a vehicle that should have become his funeral pyre. Around him, the road junction that had been a German strongpoint was now a smoking ruin that would take hours to clear and organize. The medic from Baker Company found Murphy sitting motionless on the half-track's deck 40 minutes later, his hands still gripping the machine gun handles, though the weapons had been silent for nearly half an hour. His eyes were open and tracking movement, but something in his expression made the medic approach carefully, speaking in the gentle tone reserved for men who'd been pushed beyond what anyone should have to endure. "Lieutenant? Lieutenant Murphy? You're safe now. The area's secure." Murphy blinked slowly, as if returning from somewhere very far away. The ringing in his ears was gradually fading, replaced by the more familiar sounds of an American unit consolidating after action, radios crackling with position reports, equipment being redistributed, wounded men receiving medical attention. The organized chaos of soldiers doing what soldiers do after the shooting stops. Captain Williams, Baker Company's commander, climbed onto the half-track to survey the tactical situation from Murphy's firing position. The view was sobering. German equipment burning at 3 different points, bodies scattered across ground that showed the concentrated firepower that had been directed at this single vehicle. Williams had seen the results of desperate actions before, but seldom anything quite this conclusive, accomplished by one man with improvised weapons. "How many were you facing, Lieutenant?" Murphy's answer was barely audible, his voice hoarse from shouting commands that no one else had been close enough to hear. "I don't know. Enough." The after-action report would eventually list enemy casualties, equipment destroyed, and tactical objectives accomplished. It would describe Murphy's action in the clean language of military efficiency, noting coordinates and times and ammunition expended. What it couldn't capture was the weight of those minutes when one man had held a position that should have been indefensible, or the cost of carrying that kind of memory for the rest of his life. Torres appeared at the edge of the half-track, his squad battered but intact thanks to Murphy's covering fire during their withdrawal. The sergeant's expression mixed relief with something approaching awe as he looked at his lieutenant, still sitting among the expended brass and empty ammunition boxes that marked his solitary stand. "Hell of a thing, Lieutenant. Hell of a thing." Murphy climbed down from the half-track slowly, his legs unsteady after the adrenaline had faded. Henderson handed him his carbine, the same weapon he'd given up when he started his impossible sprint across open ground. It felt strange in his hands now, too light after the massive deck guns that had become extensions of his will during those crucial minutes. The German tank destroyer was still burning, black smoke rising into the cold afternoon air above the Vosges Mountains. Murphy found himself staring at the vehicle, remembering how its main gun had looked traversing toward his position, how certain he'd been that the next few seconds would be his last. The memory felt both vivid and distant, as if it belonged to someone else who happened to share his body. Baker Company's radio operator was already transmitting the results up the chain of command, turning Murphy's actions into grid coordinates and unit identifications that would appear in situation reports read by officers who'd never heard a shot fired in anger. By evening, it would be reduced to a few lines in a division summary that mentioned enemy contact at a road junction in eastern France. Murphy walked back toward his platoon's assembly area, passing German equipment that would be catalogued and counted by intelligence personnel who specialized in turning battlefield debris into operational assessments. Someone would write a detailed analysis of German defensive capabilities based on what had happened at this road junction, but Murphy doubted they'd capture the sound of enemy soldiers laughing just before the shooting started. Sergeant Torres fell into step beside him, understanding that some conversations had to happen away from the men who looked to both of them for leadership that made sense in an environment where nothing made sense. "You know they're going to want to write this up for a medal, Lieutenant." Murphy didn't respond immediately. His attention focused on the middle distance where snow-covered pine trees marked the edge of the battlefield. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the flat tone of complete exhaustion. "They can write whatever they want. Doesn't change what it felt like." Years later, Murphy would try to explain to people who asked about his war experiences that the hardest part wasn't the fear or the violence or even the loss of friends who didn't come home. The hardest part was learning to live with the knowledge of what you could do when circumstances left no other choice, how you could keep firing when every instinct screamed for you to run, how you could function when functioning seemed impossible. The citation would eventually read like all such documents, clean sentences describing actions that had been anything but clean. It would mention tactical objectives and enemy forces engaged, but it couldn't convey the weight of those moments when time seemed to slow down, and every decision carried consequences that would echo for decades. Murphy rejoined his platoon as they prepared to move out, just another unit in the 3rd Infantry Division's advance through the Vosges Mountains of eastern France. The war would continue for months, with more road junctions to secure and more impossible positions to hold. But something had changed during those minutes on the half-track's deck, something that would follow him long after the last shot was fired and the last report was written. If this story reminded you that behind every medal there's a human being carrying memories we'll never fully see, subscribe to the channel, tell us which country you watch from, and invite someone to revisit history with us in the next story.